Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 4th of August, where I wanted to talk about our next upcoming speech number 2. But first, I wanted to thank you for uploading speech number 1 onto our Moodle site, and I will be reviewing those speeches and getting you feedback, as well as reviewing your speaking outline, which you would have sent to me via email. And if you haven't already sent me your speaking outline, please do so, sending it as a PDF to my email at ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And what I'm going to be asking for today's attendance question is for you to watch the speeches of your peers. And basically, I'm going to ask you just to send me a strength and weakness of each of those speeches to my email, and then I will compile all of that information, and I will post that on our Moodle site. But I'll talk a little bit more about that again when we get to the ending of this video. But I want you to begin thinking about speech number 2, which is an informative speech. And you have 10 minutes in which to teach the class something. And it could be about something that you already have some prior knowledge about. It could be about something that you've learned in another class or you're learning in another class. It could be something that's related to your first speech, though your first speech need not necessarily be related to your second speech. You can even elect to learn something new for this particular speech, but I usually dissuade students from doing that in a condensed session like this one, just because we're so short on time. And we will next class watch some sample informative speeches, much like we saw some sample autobiographical speeches as well. And what we will do in addition to watching those sample speeches is have our second quiz. It'll be very similar to what we did with the first quiz, 20 questions, mostly short answers, some multiple choice, some true false. It will be open book, open notes. And again, hopefully the questions will be more than just a test as to whether or not you've been watching the videos and doing the readings, but also questions that could be useful to you when you are actually delivering your speech. So that means that we are going to need to set up another kind of practice session, and this is for your second speech that's upcoming. So at any point, you can contact me to set up a meeting for talking about speech number 2, the informative speech. And we can meet either by Zoom or through telephone, through chat, email. Again, I've kept it very open-ended as to what our practice session is like. So at one extreme, you could actually record your speech and send it to me for some feedback if you wanted to. At the other extreme, you could just have an email dialogue with me about topics that you are considering, or anything in between. But I just want to make sure that I touch base with all of you about speech number 2. And we do that before you actually have to present speech number 2, which is going to be next Thursday, the 11th. So again, speech number 2 is an informative speech that will be 10 minutes long. It'll be due on the 11th of August, and that's a Thursday. And I'm assuming that since all of you had elected to upload your speeches via on Moodle, that you will make the same. You will do the same with speech number 2. And the only difference, and I'll post a new folder for you to post speech number 2 when the time comes. The only difference with speech number 2, outside of the length, it's double the length than what your first speech was, is that I'm asking that you use one audio or visual aid, which some of you might have elected to do with the first speech, but you weren't required to. But for this speech, you will be. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about today, audio-visual aids. So the chapters that I had assigned today were using visual media, which is what we will talk about, and that's chapter 11. Speeches to inform, which is chapter 12, because obviously we're at the informative speech. And I also gave another chapter, chapter 6, on supporting materials. Now, you don't need to use any outside resources for speech number 2. You will need to use outside resources for speech number 3, the persuasive speech, where you'll have 15 minutes to try to convince an audience to take a position or to take an action, or perhaps a little bit of both. But I thought it would be useful to talk about supporting materials now, because there could be the possibility that you would need to look up information for your informative speech. Again, you're free to talk about things that you already have some prior knowledge of, so you may not necessarily be required or need to look up information, but I still wanted to talk a little bit about supporting materials just in the event that you elect to do so. So I'll start with chapter 12, speeches to inform. Basically, your job again is to teach the audience. And with the addition of the textbook that I had ordered for class, on page 196, you can see that they give you some suggestions of things you might want to consider as possible topics. You could give an informative speech about a famous person, for instance, or perhaps about a locale. It would be very interesting just to learn about your hometown, for instance. Things, events, ideas, procedures, all of those are possibilities. Consider former assignments that you've done in the past. You may have written an informative paper for an English class or another class that you can adapt for this assignment. And that said, obviously there is going to need to be some adaptation because you will be presenting it. And you know that when we are presenting a speech, you need to think of not just time, but you also have to think about being conversational. So in that way, it would be different than any kind of written assignment that you might have done in the past. And 10 minutes, again, is the goal, but it's a little bit longer, so you figure anywhere between 9 to 12 minutes or 9 to 11 minutes, or so, to get it into that ballpark, but ideally as close to 10 minutes as you can. And thinking about the ways that you could proceed with the informative speech, you might give us an explanation, or in other words, tell us about something. This is very common in lectures, for instance, in colleges. Or you can also do a demonstration to show us how to do something. And both of them have their strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, if you are doing a demonstration on a video, it's going to be very different than doing a demonstration than if you were with a live audience and they were all participating along with you. Think about something like a televised cooking show. And again, the idea isn't that necessarily you are as professional as what you might see on television, but you do want to be able to clearly and concisely give your audience the information. I've heard many different informative speeches over the course of my career, things like changing the oil in your car, to things like famous historical figures, to how to make stained glass. So you have lots of opportunities here to sort of explore topics. You do want to limit your points, not just because it's only 10 minutes, and 10 minutes goes very quickly, particularly if you have content that you need to share with your audience. But keep in mind what we learned, that audiences have poor listening skills, and actually all people have poor listening skills and poor memory skills. So you don't want to inundate us with information. You want to use transitions so that you can connect between one idea to the next. You want to avoid jargon, which is specialized language that's associated with a particular discipline. So, for instance, you might be a nurse and there might be a couple of nurses in class, but you don't want to use medical terminology when you are presenting your speech because the rest of us aren't necessarily nurses. So that would be specialized language that would be useful if you were talking to a specialized audience, but you have to assume a general audience. Cluster-like ideas. So if you can gather similar things together, and this is one of the techniques that helps with memory. Associating old with new. Again, another technique that works with memory, oftentimes used in teaching, where, let's say in a math class, you review a previous concept before you go forward to the new concept. Using repetition, and the idea of hearing it over and over and over again will basically help you remember. It's one of the reasons why advertising works so well, because of its use of repetition. I once had a teacher in high school say repetition is the key to learning. He was quite correct. Address different learning styles, and that we all learn differently. Some people learn through hearing, so they learn best through an oral avenue, and some students learn better, or audiences learn better through seeing, so they learn best through a visual avenue. Some do best with actually doing. School systems favor listening and seeing. That said, the more learning styles that you can address in the presentation of your subject matter, the more likely it is that you will be able to give your subject matter in a clear and a concise way for all or at least many of your audience members. So you'll notice that in addition to these videos, which works very well for oral learners, I've also posted below the videos the notes of the major points of these videos. That works for visual learners as well. And motivating your audience, which you might need to do to motivate them, to encourage them to listen as to why the information that you are sharing with them is important. I don't think that would be a major issue for any of your topics just because of the length. 10 minutes is a very short amount of time. But I do think about something like a semester, and where oftentimes teachers, myself included, are in a position where we have to try to motivate or convince students that the curriculum of the semester is going to be applicable to their academic and professional and perhaps even personal lives. So take something like Shakespeare, which is a class that I happen to teach, and I'm very well aware that some students are in the class not necessarily because they want to learn about Shakespeare, but they want to satisfy a requirement. And my hope is that ultimately by the ending of the semester, they've not only satisfied a requirement for their degree, but they've also learned how Shakespeare talks about timeless and universal concerns and issues, so it is applicable to their lives. So, motivating your audience for the persuasive speech will be even more important, because now you're going to try to get us to change our behavior, or you might get us to change our position on something, our attitudes, our values, our beliefs. So that we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about the third speech, the 15-minute speech, where you are trying to persuade your audience of something. And again, if for those of you who are thinking ahead, you might want to think a little bit about possible topics for the persuasive speech. I don't at all dissuade you from talking about those hot button topics in our society. I wish our society was more able to talk about things that bring strong emotion. I think we do that very poorly, and it's one of the reasons why politics has become so incredibly divisive. And if we don't learn to talk about these subjects, I don't in school, I don't see how we could ever talk about these subjects in any other venue. You know, this is the gun control, abortion kind of hot button topics that you usually think of, where there are very strong, vehement opinions on both sides. Or you could talk about something that's much less controversial, because you just don't care much for controversy. You know, I've heard many a persuasive speech about trying to change your behavior so you improve your eating habits and your exercise habits, and who's going to disagree with that? The problem with that particular persuasive speech is not that people don't believe you or are persuaded by you, is that it's very difficult to actually incorporate into their behavior. So they're likely to agree but not necessarily change their behavior. And sometimes it's just easier to get somebody to behave in a particular way and not necessarily change their particular belief system. Getting somebody to sign a petition, for instance, and they might sign it because it's a good photo op or because they don't want to be bothered by you anymore. But signing that petition doesn't necessarily reflect their belief structure. So I say that, you know, it's not necessarily easier or harder whether you're trying to convince someone to change behavior or you're trying to convince somebody to change beliefs or attitudes or values. It just depends on the subject matter. But again, we'll be talking about this a little bit more when we get to the persuasive speech. But considering how condensed the summer session is, you might want to, in the back of your mind, sort of think about that. But right now, your focus is on the informative speech. What is it that you are going to be teaching us as an audience? And you are going to be using visual media, again, because if you can, or audiovisual media, again, if you can appeal to different learning styles, there's a much higher probability that your audience will remember and understand the information that you are trying to convey to them. And you can go from as low tech to as high tech as you want. And again, part of this will be dependent on the resources that you have available to you and the mode of presentation. Obviously, if we were meeting live, it would be very different than our posting speeches online. If we were in a classroom, you might elect to keep it as simple as just using the whiteboard to write out keywords and phrases. Very low tech. But again, you might decide to do something like PowerPoint. And more often than not, when people think of visual media, they think of PowerPoint. And I'm not averse to PowerPoint. I think PowerPoint could be very useful. But you have to consider the idea that PowerPoint can go wrong very quickly. So you need to be very judicious about your use of PowerPoint. And I'm sure we've all seen PowerPoint presentations that were not very good, either because the PowerPoint was used as a substitute for the actual speaker, so the speaker was relying on the PowerPoint, or the speaker read the PowerPoint notes. That would be terrible. Or there was just too much text in the PowerPoint. That also would be terrible. Or there are problems with the technology and things aren't synced. So that said, I know that you are going to be, or I assume that you are going to be presenting on video. Keep in mind that any audio or visual that you use is supposed to supplement, not substitute for your speech delivery. That what we want to see is your face and your facial expressions. So if you are going to do something like add a PowerPoint, you want to make sure that that isn't substituting for our being able to see your public speaking skills, because that's how you're being evaluated. So I do remember seeing a speech once where the individual basically had almost the entire screen filled up with PowerPoint slides, and then their visual was just this tiny box in the corner. And again, that does not satisfy the requirements of what a public speaking class is supposed to be about. That it should have been in the opposite way, that the PowerPoint was in the small box and that the actual deliverer of the speech was in the large screen so that we could see their particular presentation. Pictures work very well for emotions, and numbers and graphs and charts usually work very well for intellectual issues. We tend to be made up of both, so using both can be very helpful. In my media class, I talk about someone named Frank Luntz, who you may have heard of before. He's oftentimes consulted by politicians or by business corporations about how to best present their argument so that it's as persuasive as possible. And Frank Luntz argues, that regardless of how we want to think that we are ruled by intellect, we really are ruled by emotion, and intellect is secondary. And I think he's quite right in many respects. Video and audio clips as well can work. Think about, again, balance. You've got a 10-minute speech, so you don't want to have a 9-minute video clip. If you had an hour speech, you might be able to do a 9-minute video clip. But again, you want to have balance. I'm thinking no more than 3 minutes maximum out of the 10 if you were going to show some sort of a clip. And I think about the early days of PowerPoint. I don't know if any of you ever heard of a flip chart, which really was a kind of pre-PowerPoint, where you literally had this large pad of paper where each sheet would have a different piece of information, and you would just flip or reveal the sheet to reveal the information. And what was wonderful about it, and what's wonderful about PowerPoint, is that you get to decide when you are going to reveal that particular piece of information. So screen sharing, if you're using Zoom, is another option. But again, you want to make sure that you've got the technology down, and you also have to be prepared for technological malfunction, because that's just the reality of our world. I suggest to students that when they are delivering a speech, that they always have a hard copy of their speaking outline, that they're not relying on something like a screen of PowerPoint slides, or even just a screen of the actual speaking outline, because then if there is a technological difficulty and you were to happen to be unable to access those slides, not only can you not access the PowerPoint that you wanted to show with your audience, but show to your audience, but now you also don't have your speaking outline. So having a hard copy. And again, sometimes because of technological failure, it has absolutely nothing to do with you. You might have to go low tech. It could be as easy again as scribbling something on a whiteboard or on a piece of paper. But that's better than nothing, than using no audio visual. I'll always remember in the early days of the internet, there was a presentation that I went to about how to incorporate technology and computers into classroom curriculum. And it was for my entire department. It's not easy because my department is rather large, the English department, to get everybody together. It was during a summer, no less. And they found a date and a time, and right at the very beginning of the presentation, we lost our electricity. And actually, most of Greenfield had lost their electricity at that point. And we had a good 5 or 6 hours scheduled for this presentation. And obviously, it wouldn't be cost effective to just leave and waste the time that we had scheduled for that. And the presenters continued on. And it's no easy thing to present computers and using technology when you can't use computers or use technology. So I always thought that it was a valiant effort. No, it wasn't perfect, but there is no such thing as the perfect speech. The idea is that faced with that difficulty, they adapted on the fly, and we were able to get the information that we needed to get. So always think about that if you ever have a situation where there is technological failure. Don't panic. Just adapt to the best of your abilities. But you should have a backup plan. Again, charts work very nicely for numbers, and especially because numbers can tend to be abstract, so being able to see something visual can be very useful with numbers. Pictures work very well with emotions. Again, you have to think about things like scale. You know, it can't be too large, it can't be too small, you know, it's got to be appropriate for the situation. One thing I can say is regardless of which audio or visual you use, you want to be clear, you want to be simple, you want to be neat, you want to be professional. Use color for interest. Don't use too much color. The idea that you want to show all the bells and whistles of your technology, unless you are teaching us how to use your technology. But again, you don't have to have a PowerPoint slide that's got 15 different fonts and that's got 25 different colors. That's just way too overwhelming. So save color for interest. Again, think about balance and proportion in terms of time and in scale with your audio visual. Avoid using all capitals, because if you've ever seen text written in all caps, then you would know that it's very difficult to read. So basically what you want to do is save all caps for something that's of great importance. Though, interestingly, what studies have shown that if you are trying to emphasize a point, the best way to have someone remember it is to bold that point. Not necessarily to all capitalize it or to underline it either, but to bold it. And in terms of supporting materials, I had indicated that I don't necessarily expect you to use outside resources. At this point, the test is whether or not you can seamlessly incorporate an audio or a visual. And while we usually have a combination of the two, it could be just purely a visual, or it could be just purely an audio, a song, for instance, that you might want to analyze. But more often than not, it probably is a combination of two, because we are a multimedia society. But, you know, something as simple as even showing a prop. Again, you have to think about size and scale and how to go about doing that. Could easily satisfy the requirements of the assignment. Or a handout if you were meeting in person. That works very well if you want to leave the audience with something. Perhaps very detailed information with phone numbers and web addresses and so forth. So you want to have it written out. So feel free to, you know, be as simple or as complex as you'd like with your audio visual. I just look for one. After that, I stop counting, but you can use as many as you would like. So as we continue forward, and talk a little bit about supporting materials in the event that you decided that you wanted to do some outside research. Now, supporting materials tend to increase credibility and persuasiveness. It's one of the reasons why we will be using outside resources for our persuasive speech. But you need to make sure that you're checking for accuracy. And when most people, when they hear audiovisual and their response is PowerPoint, when most people hear outside resources, their response usually is Google or Wikipedia. I'm not averse to Wikipedia, and nor am I averse to Google. I use them all. But that said, keep in mind that Google is a search engine that basically uses algorithms that are based on commerce. And once you think about something like the other options that you have as a college student for search engines that the general public doesn't have because you have to pay for access, but because you've paid your tuition, that means you've already paid for access, then it makes sense that you use those search engines that are available through our library, because their algorithms are based on content, not necessarily on commerce. That said, you also know that anybody can post anything on the internet, which is wonderful but also horrible at the same time. We've never had more access to information and more democratic sharing of information. Ironically, we've never had less access to information, again, because usually if we go through a search engine, we probably are only going to look at the first 3 or 4 options, even though that search engine might generate hundreds of thousands of options. And again, we can't even guarantee the validity of the information that we're getting because anybody can post anything. So all of this is my prelude to encourage you to use the GCC library system or another academic library system, because not only will much of the materials that you have access to be vetted, in other words, librarians would have reviewed their accuracy, but I think it will also save a good amount of time because it would be less like looking for a needle in a haystack, which is oftentimes what a Google search can come down to. So you can see that in the notes below under the section supporting materials, I've got the website for the GCC library, and you can find that on the GCC website on every page because the library is such an important resource for students. And the GCC library, in addition to books, yes, books still exist, and magazines, there are also databases. And these are electronic resources that look very similar to what you might find on the open web, but they are not available on the open web. They're available through subscription, and the reason why is because they hire staffs of individuals to review the information before posting online to verify a certain level of authenticity. And that said, there can still be errors. You should always question the information that you're given, regardless of the source. But certainly it is much safer to use a database than it is to use the wide open web. And I once had somebody say that the difference between using a database and using something like Google would be similar to safe and unsafe sex. That Google is unsafe sex. You'll probably be fine, but there is a risk. And that the databases are like safe sex, and that it's very likely that you can avoid difficulties if you are engaging in safe sex. Yes, they still can happen, but the percentage is much, much lower. So I think of it that way. But nevertheless, one of the things you want to consider is how do you let your audience know that you're using outside resources? Now, if you've taken an English class, and English 101 is the prerequisite for this particular course, so I'm assuming you have, you've probably learned about documenting your sources. And in English and in the humanities, we use the MLA, the Modern Language Association. It's just a system of documentation where at the ending of a quote, we use parentheses, and then in those parentheses, we give some information about where to find that quote, let's say page number. And then at the very ending of our paper or presentation, we list all of the sources that we cited or that we quoted and they're all listed by author's last name in alphabetical order, so that you could easily find the additional information that you would need, so that you could find the source right down to the same edition, which would have the same page numbers, so you could verify the authenticity of that quote. And there are different small differences between how you would notate a book as opposed to a magazine, as opposed to a website, as opposed to, we can go on and on. And so it's a system that people don't usually memorize. You just look up, well, how do I cite a television program, for instance, and then you just follow the criteria for a television program. That said, a speech is meant to be much more informal and conversational. So you don't want to inundate your audience with things like page numbers and place of publication and publisher. So it's much simpler in many respects when you are presenting a speech, because you just want to give your audience a tag, which is just a verbal cue that you are citing from an outside source. It could even be something as simple as, according to experts, 38% of individuals believe. Now, the assumption is, because I've said according to experts, that this was not my original scholarship. Now, you should be prepared to give additional information from your audience, or to provide additional information to your audience. So you might be asked, who are those experts, or when was that study made? And you should have it in your notes, or maybe even in your head. But considering how poor our memories are, I would very much recommend that you have it in your speaking notes, so that you could share the details of that information with your audience. So you want to be able to give a verbal tag. That said, when we think about the kinds of supporting material you might use, you can also use interviews. And again, you want to be ethical. Remember, we talked about ethos at the beginning of the semester. And if you are interviewing someone, you should have their permission to interview them. You should have the permission to share what they said with other individuals. If they want to remain anonymous, you should honor that particular request and give them a pseudonym. You can also think about the distinction between a primary account, which is a first-hand account. That's a witness account, and that can be very valuable, because ultimately, well, the witness was there. Take somebody like a witness from World War II. I mean, somebody who was actually there would be able to tell you what they saw. But that's not the only way to evaluate World War II. Obviously, many years have gone by since then, and certainly the individual that you are consulting could be mistaken, or could be trying to deceive, or could just have a limited viewpoint, which is where we get to secondary accounts. And these are based on primary, or the eyewitness accounts, and this is scholarship, where you've got basically lots of different viewpoints that are coalesced together. And a combination is usually best, that you're not relying all on primary, and you're not relying all on secondary. You've got both. And then you've got to think about the distinction between qualitative evidence, anecdotes and stories, as opposed to quantitative evidence, which is facts and numbers. And again, both are valuable. So things like graduation rates would be quantitative. How many people graduate from a particular college? But that doesn't necessarily tell all of the story, or even most of the story, because there could be a very high transfer rate, let's say. So people aren't graduating, but they're still doing quite well. So this is where the qualitative, or the anecdotes, come in, where people can explain and give their experiences. This would be something like getting somebody's feedback about the quality of their education, as opposed to looking at their test scores. Looking at the test scores would be quantitative. Qualitative would be more getting their anecdotes and their storytelling. And again, one isn't better than another. Ideally, you'd have a combination of the two. And as I indicated, we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to our persuasive speech, where I'm going to ask you to use 3 outside resources. Now, certainly you can use more than 3, but I stopped counting after 3. And what I'm going to ask is that in your final speaking outline for your persuasive speech, that you list those 3 resources, so that I can just take a quick peek at them. In the real world, you would never necessarily have to provide a list of your resources to your audience unless they asked you for that. And again, if you were asked, you should be able to provide that, or to reconstruct that for them, because again, you want to show that you are ethical and that you aren't basically creating information, that this can all be verified based on the sources that you are able to share with others. So this helps keep you honest, so to speak, when you are presenting. But in terms of the informative speech, where you are now is thinking about what will you be discussing for your informative speech. How do you adapt that to 10 minutes? And what audio or visual or visuals, but again, I stop after one, will you be using? Now, the informative speech is usually a place where you get questions. This is going to be a little bit more complex if you are uploading your video, because obviously we're not going to have that give and take. So to try to anticipate what some questions might be and addressing them is always a useful technique. Or if you are in a position where you're giving a speech live or on Zoom, being able to anticipate the audience questions before you present so that you are as well prepared as possible. And it's not possible to prepare for every contingency, but the hope is that you could answer most of the audience questions. And better to just say, I don't know, or I'll look it up, than to make something up on the fly. Again, you want to be ethical. You want to show ethos. So next class, as I said, there's going to be a quiz, and that quiz will hopefully be of use to you when you are thinking about your second speech. That second quiz will be on chapters 9 and 10 and chapters 4 and 5. So chapter 9 was on wording your speech, chapter 10 was on delivering your speech, chapter 4 was on public speaking and cultural challenges, and chapter 5 was on understanding your audience. And 20 questions, much like the previous quiz. And then I will also have some practice speeches on YouTube, practice informative speeches from students like yourself, but in no way affiliated with GCC, for you to view next class. And what I'm going to ask you to do on our class discussion forum is just to identify one strength and one weakness, which is what our attendance question is going to be about in terms of speech number 1 for your peers. So today's attendance question, this will be due on Saturday, the 6th of August at 9 a.m. Ask me if you need an extension. And I ask that this time, rather than posting it on our discussion forum, you send this to my email, because I want it to be private so that I can compile all of the data and present it as one element to all of you next class. So your assignment is to watch speech number 1, which was posted by your other classmates, and this would be in the top Moodles folder section for speech number 1. And then briefly just send me in an email one strength and one weakness of each of those speeches. And again, I'll compile all of that. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.